The charge is treason. The defendant, Georges Clément, ex-Belgian planter, ex-Congo mercenary. He is on trial today at Fulchester Crown Court for leading an armed revolt on the Caribbean island of Santa Isabella when it was still part of Her Majesty's overseas territories. 25 people died.
Mr. Clément, you have admitted you led the landing at Santa Isabella.
Yes.
How many men did you have under your command?
30.
How did you come ashore?
In 2 launches. Myself, Hans Schneider, and 9 men were in the first launch. Henri de Plessis was in command of the second launch.
Now, what happened when you landed?
They were waiting for us. I don't know how they knew. Perhaps Simon Chase had told them, I don't know.
Can you remember the precise order of events on the beach?
Who has time to be precise when the shooting starts?
Try.
Well, a couple of flares went up. We were caught. Half of us stood in the water, half on the beach. And someone started shooting.
Who?
How should I know? Someone on the other side.
They definitely fired first.
Yes. I saw Henri de Plessis and Pierre Vienne go down almost immediately. I'd known Pierre for nearly 20 years. He owned a store about 15 miles from my plantation. They did not have a chance.
Do you remember anyone calling upon you to surrender?
No, the shooting started as soon as the flares went up.
And you managed to escape?
Yes, myself and 2 others.
You made your way to England?
Yes.
Why?
Where else could I get any money?
You hope to obtain this money from your wife?
Of course.
Is that the only reason you came back?
Yes. My marriage was at an end, but I had to have money. Who else could I turn to? Believe me, penniless mercenaries are not popular anywhere.
And did you get any money from your wife?
No, I did not have the chance.
What was your plan if you had obtained this money?
To get to Belgium or Germany, and then who knows? I was finished whatever I'd done.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Clément.
Now, Mr. Clément, do you know what proof is?
Yes?
Then what proof can you offer us, apart from your own unsubstantiated testimony, that the story of yours of the loss of your plantation during the Congo uprising is true?
This.
Well, that's not proof, Mr. Clément. That's window dressing, designed to justify the bloody massacre that Mr. Chase witnessed.
No. My wife was killed by these savages. My plantation was destroyed.
And now, Mr. Clément, do you know what allegiance is?
I'm not a lawyer.
His Lordship explained the concept of allegiance yesterday.
I do not remember his exact words.
But they're surprising for someone who claims to remember in detail a telephone conversation of some months ago.
What is surprising about that? A telephone conversation I can understand, legal language I cannot.
And yet your defense is aimed at persuading the jury that you do not owe allegiance to the British Crown.
I am not conducting my defense. Mr. Lotterby is ask him.
Well, there's no need for that, Mr. Clément. The law is quite clear on that point. As an alien, you are held to owe allegiance to the Crown if your wife and property are under the protection of the Crown.
I gave up my share of the property before I went to Honduras. My marriage is over. My wife is divorcing me.
Ah, yes, the famous divorce. When was it filed?
What?
On what date was your divorce filed?
I don't know.
Well, then let me enlighten you. Your wife filed the divorce on the day after you were arrested by the Special Branch.
What does the date matter?
But a great deal, Mr. Clément. If the divorce had been filed before you returned to Fulchester while you were in Honduras, as you suggest, then one might be prepared to accept that the marriage had already broken up. The jury might be prepared to believe that under those circumstances you did not owe allegiance. But to file the divorce the day after your arrest...
My wife did not know where I was.
Well, any solicitor would have told her that you don't need to know your husband's whereabouts in order to start divorce proceedings. Anyway, I see my learned friend is calling Mrs. Clément as his next witness, so I shall be able to ask her personally.
No! Leave my wife out of it.
Well, you brought her into it, Mr. Clément, not I.
Mr. Clement, I will not have language like that used in this court.
My lord, I wish to apologize.
More to the point, Mr. Lotterby. Do you wish to re-examine Mr. Clement?
No, my lord.
You may leave the witness box, Mr. Clement.
I call Mrs. Margaret Clément.
Margaret Clément, please. What is your religion?
Church of England.
Take the book in your right hand and read aloud the words on the card.
I swear by Almighty God that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
You are Margaret Clement, wife of the defendant.
I am.
You live at the Highmore Hotel near Fulchester?
Yes.
Your husband, Georges Clement, has no financial interest in this hotel.
None at all.
When did you marry?
In 1969.
You met your husband in the Congo.
Yes. We met first about 15 years ago. I was a nurse in a hospital in Leopoldville, as it then was.
What was your impression of Georges Clement at that time?
Oh, he was a happy, extrovert sort of person. He had a big plantation up country.
He was a successful planter.
Oh, yes, very.
He was married at that time, I believe.
Yes.
When did you see him again?
In Europe.
Yes.
In 1969 in Brussels.
Mm-hmm. How did you meet?
Well, we were both staying at the same hotel. He came up and introduced himself.
He introduced himself. Didn't you remember him from Leopoldsville?
No. He was so changed, I didn't recognize him at all.
In what way was he changed?
Well, it wasn't just that he was 15 years older. Or his face.
The scar, you mean?
Yes.
There was a big change in him?
Oh, yes. You wouldn't have thought he was the same man. He was very quiet, not happy at all, and bitter, terribly bitter.
About what had happened to him in the Congo?
Oh, yes. He just couldn't accept it.
What couldn't he accept?
What had happened? Why it had happened. He'd lost his plantation, his wife, and then when Chambé fled, his command. And he couldn't understand why people seemed to regard him as some kind of bloodthirsty monster just because he fought for Chambé. All he was trying to do was to get back his plantation.
And you decided to get married?
Yes.
Why did you decide to settle in this country?
Well, there weren't many other places we could go. There weren't many countries that were willing to have Georges Clement living there.
You could have stayed in Belgium.
Georges was born in the Belgian Congo. Belgium itself was a foreign country to him.
So you came to England?
Yes. I'd been left some money by an aunt, and so I suggested we come over here and get a business. We bought the hotel.
Were you happy?
At first. At least I was, but Georges never seemed to be able to settle.
He was restless?
He couldn't shake himself free from the past. He was always brooding about it.
Did this obsession with the past create difficulties with the marriage?
It made him very difficult to live with.
In what way?
Well, sometimes he would just go off, disappear for days on end.
Was this when he began to make these visits to Amsterdam?
Yes, I think it must have been.
Did he tell you whom he met on these occasions?
Well, he said he'd seen some of his men, the men he'd fought with in the Congo. Schneider, Duplessis, Vienne.
But did he give you any indication as to the purpose of these meetings?
He said they just used to talk about old times, but he always seemed moodier when he came back from Amsterdam.
Did you know whether they were planning the invasion of Santa Isabella?
No.
It would be true to say, would it not, Mrs. Clement, that until your husband left you, you had no idea what his plans were?
That's right.
When did he leave you?
In January. He just packed up and went.
Had the marriage finally broken down by that time?
Yes.
What arrangements did he make with you before he left?
Financial arrangements? you
Yes.
mean? Well, before he left, he said that I was to have his share of the hotel. I was to be the sole owner. He signed a piece of paper giving me everything.
Will you look at this paper? Thank you. Is this the piece of paper he signed?
Yes.
Exhibit number 4, my lord. So, at the time of his departure, he did not, in fact, have any property in this country.
That's correct.
And you have already told us that by that time, your marriage had already broken down.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Clement.
Now, Mrs. Clement, you have sworn to tell the truth.
Yes.
And you understand, do you not, that if you lie to this court, you could be found guilty of perjury?
I know that.
Yes, you see, I put it to you, Mrs. Clement, that your evidence is a tissue of lies.
No.
I put it to you that you have one aim in view, to get the jury to find your husband not guilty.
That's not true. Of course I don't want him to go to jail, but I told the truth.
Well, let's examine that truth, shall we, Mrs. Clement? Now, first of all, let's clear up this nonsense about the hotel. You said in evidence on oath that your husband made the hotel over to you before he went off to Honduras.
Yes.
And that's the document you've just seen.
Yes.
Now, what date does that bear?
It's not dated.
Oh. Oh, so he could have drawn it up at any time, could he?
Well, he could have done, yes, but he did it before he left.
It's rather a cavalier way, is it not, of dealing with what must be a valuable piece of property, scrawling on a piece of paper?
He's not a lawyer.
Well, yet your husband gave as one of his reasons for returning to Fulchester after the Santa Isabella incident the fact that he wanted to complete the legal side of handing over the hotel.
Up till that time, there was only that piece of paper.
Yes, which he could have drawn up at any time.
Well, I'm sorry, but that's how it happened. George just wanted to make the whole thing legal.
Well, his subsequent behaviour would appear to belie that, Mrs. Clement. And all the same, if your husband wished merely to tie up the legal side of handing over the property, he could have done so quite adequately by letter, thus avoiding the risk of arrest. All he had to do was contact a solicitor who would have drawn up the necessary deed.
Well, he didn't do it like that.
Well, evidently. But what I don't understand, Mrs. Clement, is why he should bother at all.
What do you mean?
Well, you yourself said, Mrs. Clement, that the marriage was in ruins long before he left you to take part in this tragic invasion.
Yes.
So why should he bother what happened to you?
Well, it wasn't just me. There was Paul to think of.
Paul?
My son.
Oh, yes. What nationality is your son?
English, of course.
Yes, yes. Now, in your evidence to my learned friend, you are not specific as to the reason for the breakdown of the marriage.
Marriages break down for all kinds of reasons.
Yes. Now, the reasons you cited, if I may summarize them, would appear to include mysterious and unexplained disappearances, presumably to meet his ex-mercenary friends, and general moodiness.
There were other reasons.
Yes, well, there would have to be, wouldn't there, Mrs. Clement? I mean, the reasons you cited hardly give grounds for divorce.
You try living with a man who's obsessed with the past.
But you did mention that there were other reasons for the breakdown. What were they?
Well, my lord, this is a very personal matter. Do I have to answer these questions?
Yes, I'm afraid you do, Mrs. Clement.
It's very embarrassing.
Yes, it is.
Now, what are the other reasons for the breakdown of the marriage?
George was violent sometimes.
Violent?
He hit me on occasions.
When?
I didn't make a note of the exact dates.
Well, what were the occasions when your husband struck you?
Well, when I complained about his trips.
Yes, and were there any witnesses of these assaults?
No.
What?
We didn't have rows in public. You can't afford to if you're running an hotel.
No, did anyone ever comment about your bruises?
No.
Well, none of your customers?
No.
What, to your knowledge, did anyone ever notice these bruises?
I don't know.
Well, I mean, they did exist, I suppose, these bruises.
I've said they did.
Did you, Mrs. Clement? Do you love your husband, Mrs. Clement?
What?
I said, do you still love your husband?
I don't know.
Well, either you do or you do not, Mrs. Clement.
Well, I'm still fond of him, if that's what you mean. Besides, he's the father of my son.
Well, you don't have to apologize for it, Mrs. Clement.
I'm not.
Now, I'd like to return for a moment to the question of the hotel, the High Moor, is it not?
Yes.
Now, how much did you pay for it?
£28,000.
Yes, that was about 1970.
Yes.
Who provided the finance?
We both did.
Do you have a mortgage?
Not a very large one.
And how much money did you put down in cash?
£20,000.
Of which how much did you personally contribute?
About £7,000.
Yes, that was money I think you said you'd recently inherited.
Yes.
Yes. So your husband was able to contribute approximately £13,000 towards the hotel.
Something like that.
Yes, a very creditable effort for a man who is supposed to have lost his all in the Congo.
Well, I wouldn't know about that.
No. Well, do you know where the money came from?
No.
You see, I'd put it to you, Mrs. Clement, that your evidence is a patchwork of lies designed to save your husband. What in fact happened was that his political involvement and his financial greed simultaneously inspired him to take off and lead this revolt. And believing that he could return to his wife and his property secure from arrest because of his Belgian nationality.
No.
Now, when did you become aware that your husband was planning this Caribbean escapade?
Well, I knew that something was in the air, but I never knew precisely what. It might have been just that he'd been planning to leave me.
But he never told you?
No.
Well, perhaps he was too busy beating you up? Now, Mrs. Clement, did the special branch give you instructions in the event of your husband returning to this country as a fugitive after the Santa Isabella debacle?
Yes, they asked me to telephone them if he got in touch with me.
Yes. Did you do so, Mrs. Clement?
Oh, my lord, my learned friend is inviting the witness to incriminate herself.
My lord, I fail to see how, whether such a phone call was made or not, could possibly incriminate the witness.
The witness could lay herself open to a charge of being an accessory after the fact.
But all she has to do is answer yes or no. Either she made the phone call or she did not.
So I think Mr. Parsons' question's valid, Mr. Lotterby, but on the other hand, I do take your point. You may put your question, Mr. Parsons, but please bear in mind that the witness has the right to avoid self-incrimination.
Yes, I understand, my lord. Now, Mrs. Clement, did you phone the special branch?
No.
But you knew what your husband had done.
The papers were full of it. I could hardly miss knowing.
So why didn't you telephone?
Well, I didn't see why I should do the police's work for them. Besides, he's my husband.
Well, for a marriage that had allegedly broken down, Mrs. Clement, you seem to have shown a great deal of concern for your husband.
Mrs. Clement, had your marriage finally broken down by the time your husband left for Amsterdam?
Yes,
Are you at this moment petitioning for a divorce?
I am.
In the time you've been married, has your husband ever drawn up any legal document in which to settle a private matter between the two of you?
No.
In the time you've been married, has he ever shown any profound knowledge as to the workings of English law?
None whatsoever.
Were you at all surprised as to the casual way in which he handed over to you his share of the Highmore Hotel?
Not at all. I'd have been surprised if he'd done it any other way.
And you're certain that that document in which he handed everything over to you was written before he left you?
Yes, I am.
So effectively he had no business interests in this country, no property, no wife, nothing for him to leave under the protection of the Crown?
No. He just cut himself off from me and from everything in this country.
Thank you, Mrs. Clement. No further questions.
You may stand down, Mrs. Clement.
That completes the case for the defence, my lord.
Mr. Parsons?
May it please your lordship. Members of the jury, for centuries, treason has been regarded as the gravest of crimes. Grave because it is a denial of the allegiance we all of us owe to our crown and to our country. It is, in fact, a denial of the allegiance we owe to each other. Now, let us be clear about the obvious facts first of all. Georges Clement does not deny organizing and leading an armed revolt on one of Her Majesty's territories. He did not so admit at the beginning of this trial, but you yourselves all heard him, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, admit so during a violent outburst on the second day of this trial. Now, the defendant and his wife have played a brave charade, pretending that the marriage was over long before he left for Honduras, and that he had signed over the ownership of the hotel to her, thus hoping to prove he did not owe allegiance. Now, the divorce was filed on the day after his arrest. The hotel was signed over on an undated scrap of paper. Now, I'm sure his lordship will direct you once again on the meaning of allegiance. I will not go over it in my speech. A great deal of time has been spent during this trial in talking about it, perhaps to the extent that we have forgotten that 25 people were killed in Mr. Clement's admitted revolt, and 13 of them were British subjects protecting Crown property. It is sad when a human being admits to such a deed with pride. Mr. Clement does so. And I put it to you, members of the jury, that when Mr. Clement fled Santa Isabella early that morning, he returned to his wife, his child, and his property, hoping at that time that either no one would know of his participation in the revolt or that he was immune from arrest because of his Belgian nationality. Mr. Clement was wrong on both counts, and I put it to you, members of the jury, you have no option but to find him guilty.
My lord, members of the jury, politics, like drama, demands a villain. And if he doesn't exist naturally, he has to be invented. And Georges Clement was a convenient political scapegoat. Now, you've heard his evidence, members of the jury. Is this man a deliberate traitor to the crown? Surely not. He's a bitter, unhappy man who is exiled from his home, Africa. Oh, he's the ideal tool for politicians. A brave but basically simple man. A man who isn't likely to ask any awkward questions. But you must, ladies and gentlemen. And the question you must ask yourselves is simply whether Georges Clement owed any allegiance to this country at all. Now, we have heard certain tape recordings of alleged phone conversations that took place in this country. And we've heard that the defendant appears to be plotting the rebellion. But much doubt has been thrown on the authenticity of these recordings. It's obvious that the special branch wanted to make absolutely sure of a conviction. And is it indeed likely that an experienced mercenary like Georges Clermont would plot armed revolt over the phone. I mean, as he himself has said, we are not fools and amateurs. Before setting out on this pathetic expedition, Mr. Clermont made over to his wife his share of the hotel they jointly owned. Mrs. Clermont has said the marriage was finished before he left on his abortive expedition. Therefore, members of the jury, Georges Clermont owed no allegiance to this country at the time of the insurrection, and consequently you must find him not guilty.
Members of the jury, your verdict must, by nature of the case for the defense, turn on your interpretation on the question of allegiance. Protection and allegiance are reciprocal, or as one judge said in olden days, protection draws allegiance, and allegiance draw protection. In other words, if you or your family or your possessions lie within the protection of the realm, then no matter whether you are a citizen of that realm or not, you owe allegiance to that realm. Now, if I could quote another legal authority, if an alien live here and enjoy the benefit of the king's protection and committed treason, he shall be judged as a traitor. Now, whilst Clement was living in this country, he clearly owed allegiance. But the question is, was he plotting this rebellion then? He says he was not. Because if he was, he's clearly guilty of treason. He admits plotting this rebellion after he left this country, but he says that he had no intention of returning, that he had abandoned his possessions to his wife, and that he had abandoned his wife and child. Well, it's my duty to direct you, members of the jury, that if that story is true, he is not guilty of treason. But he did return to this country. And you must ask yourselves why. You may think that his reason for returning casts some doubt upon his defense. He says he came back here because he needed money, and he had nowhere else to go to get it. Now, members of the jury, in considering your verdict, you mustn't be influenced by the severity of the sentence that I shall be forced to impose should you find the defendant guilty. It is for the judge to sentence. It is for the jury to weigh the evidence and to arrive at a just verdict. Now, will you retire and consider your verdict?
All stand.
The jury has been out for over 3 hours now.
Members of the jury, are you agreed on your verdict?
Yes.
Do you find the prisoner Georges Albert Clermont guilty or not guilty of treason?
Guilty.
Is that the verdict of you all?
Yes.
George Albert Clement, you have been found guilty of treason, the gravest crime known to law. You knowingly and deliberately led an insurrection against Her Majesty the Queen and her duly elected ministers. You willingly caused the deaths of some 25 people, at least 13 of whom were Her Majesty's subjects. The sentence of this court is that you shall be taken from here to a lawful prison, and from thence to a place of execution, where you shall be hanged by the neck until you are dead, and that your body be afterwards buried in the precincts of the prison in which you shall have been confined before your execution. And may the Lord have mercy on your soul.
Next week, a chance for you to join another jury when our cameras return to the Crown Court.